Welcome back to another Profitless on Purpose podcast, the podcast where a couple of accountants get together and talk about the news and issues regarding nonprofits from an accountant's perspective. I'm one of your hosts, AJ Wheeler, but I'm not the only host here. We have Lisa Sheldon and Tammy Hess with us this week. Welcome, Tammy.
Oh, thank you.
And we got some good articles this week, and I think Lisa's going to start us off. So, Lisa, what do you got for us?
So I got a great article today that I found about from Inside Charity, and it is talking about nonprofit worker unionization. Actually, it's a pretty long, in-depth article, but really, what I found most interesting about it is that it's the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, and they're really a huge influencer in the world of nonprofits. They are the ones that are out there. Helping to pass legislation, helping to guide accounting standards, helping to guide all of these things at the state and the national level. And one of the things that they do is they provide training, generally to management, regarding things like diversity, regarding how do you treat your employees. It's a lot of employee relational training, and this MNC is now announced that they're going up for a vote to decide whether or not their workers are going to become unionized. And the funny part of it is the reason that they decided that they want to become unionized is because MNC management is not following the training that they're giving. These employees are feeling like they're not heard, like they're being, they have no input, they have no say so in how they do their work or in things that are happening within the organization. They just feel their ideas are not heard. And so I think it's a really interesting article from that perspective, but it also goes into a lot of detail about what that's going to mean for the rest of the not-for-profit world and whether or not that the unionization is going to trickle down through other organizations within the state of Minnesota and then nationally, how that's going to funnel out to other organizations and how that's going to open them up to allow unions to get in. It did cite things like, the unions had gotten into higher education, had gotten into other, governmental institutions. And having come from a higher educational institution where we did have unions, I can see that happening. I can see how the unions can get in there. I did see a lot of positives that the union brought. But there are also some of those negatives where, it's tough sometimes to get things done when you've got to battle the union. And so it's just tough sometimes. But I think that from the perspective of employees aren't being heard, they just want to be heard, right? And if you don't, if you're thinking that maybe union's not the way to go for your organization, if you're a manager out there, maybe you want to start thinking about how you can address the needs of your employees before they come to that conclusion on their own and want to bring a union in. Tammy, AJ, anybody's got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I thought what was interesting about that is that the issues that were raised by the employees are wanting to seek to be unionized, those are huge issues. And if the donors actually had heard of those or knew about them, I think that they would really just maybe decide not to donate or to support that cause because the organization is not being ran as efficiently or effectively as they would want to, and that the employees are so unhappy. I think that was what was really surprising to me was how many people are feeling like they aren't being heard or they weren't part of the decision making. And they're talked obviously about compensation and benefits and all those things that I'm not sure if the union going to a union is the right answer. It's almost like a big, broader discussion of leadership and management to what you said, Lisa, like, the managers and supervisors probably need to rethink of how they're working with employees or how they're setting up their organization to be a place where people want to work and do their best work.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think also too, we already have some kind of unionization in the nonprofit sector already. If you work in a state or city government and you have a police and fire, employees, those are usually in a union themselves. And so one of the big sticking points and one of the problems that is always faced every 2 or 3 years is the collective bargaining agreement that goes on for salaries and benefits. And so they can drag down the and slow to a crawl the operations of those city managers and such when you're in a long, heated, kind of negotiation between that. But I think you bring up a really good point, Tammy, where if the employees are feeling like they don't have any other way but to unionize, I think that's a pretty far down the road, and it probably needs to be cut off at the pass quicker than that. What you're essentially doing with the union is you're putting your faith in your salary and benefit negotiation into the hands of like an elected few, but the few for the union. And I think you'd be better served trying to strive individually, maybe at each individual nonprofit. And I would bring to the forefront that nonprofits should be doing like a salary assessment for employees and making sure that that a going rate is given in an hourly wage, and that benefit, if it's not, that benefits reflect that and are added on. Normally what happens at a nonprofit, or what I've seen in the past, is wages are probably depressed a little bit from the rest of like a for-profit area, but benefits and kind of like the workability of the place that you're working at is better. So it's kind of a trade-off. You're making probably less money, but you're getting more flexibility and you're accelerating your skills at a faster pace because you're in an industry and in a sector that allows you to do so. So I think when you're thinking about unionization, I think it's important, for employees as well as the managers there to weigh all those considerations that may be out there looming if you unionize like this. So, and not to put a stake in the ground that unions are good or unions are bad. It's just kind of the nature of the beast when you're working with a union, and then, it's kind of union versus whatever the entity is, and you have to come together on an agreement around it. It's why we see so many teacher strikes, because they can't come to an agreement on benefits and wages for those employees. So, but do you have another article for us, Tammy?
I do. So mine's from Future Fundraising Now, and it's titled "How Great Nonprofits Throw Piles of Money Out the Window." And the author is writing about a donation experience they had in which they provided a mid-value donor-advised donation to an organization. And after a couple of weeks, they received the standard acknowledgement letter. After a couple of months, they received a handwritten thank you card, and then nothing. So it seems like they were looking for the organization to do more, like to share how their donation was helping, or to provide opportunities for them to get more involved. And not hearing from them caused them to want to do more. So what I liked about this article was that it gave some ideas as to what organizations could or should do when receiving donations. And some examples are: call new donors to thank them, acknowledge donations quickly, be as personable as possible, report back, and to develop a plan for every donor. The main point is to not go silent on any donor. This really got me thinking as to, what should the expectation of a donor be after they donate, and what organizations should consider in terms of how much they do after receiving a donation. What do you all think?
Yeah, those are some really good points I think that the author brings up, because I think I've seen both sides of the table where, and I think managing expectations is true in any kind of relationship, whether it be business, personal, or a charitable organization. And I think the most successful nonprofits I've seen have that kind of follow-up to their donors, whether it be a grantor, an individual donor, an institutional donor, even donor advised funds, which we'll talk about in our next article. But the most successful ones I've seen have that follow-up. And it's not just a follow-up asking for more money. It's showing them what they've done with the money that they've raised. And they accomplish that in a couple ways. Annual reports are a great way to do that, because you can kind of shoehorn in everything you want to talk about, and you have a touch point with your donors through contact, either through email or snail mail. And it provides them a yearly look back at like how many people were served, what was accomplished, the financial position. Usually in a very small swath of that annual report kind of shows where they are financially and how they can help. And then I think it just provides a feel-good update to that. you can even take it as far as personalizing it, where you can show somebody, like I think like a lot of the foreign, charities that help children actually send like a photo of the family that helped. And that's probably really impactful for somebody that is wanting to help somebody in an underserved foreign country, where they actually get a photo of the family and an update on where their money has gone, I think is really impactful. So I would say, big to small nonprofits, you probably just need to let your donors know in some sort of way. And I think probably the easiest and best way and a good kind of rule of thumb is that annual report. But I don't know, maybe I'm leaving something out. What do you think, Lisa?
I like the article as well, and I've given to donations to different organizations, and sometimes you get a newsletter that might be quarterly or semi-annually. It does give a nice update. It gives a little bit of information and it helps you to see where your money's going and what your money's doing. But I think the big one is, if you're not reaching out to your donors, some of them, if they're passionate about your organization, they may want to be involved in some other way. And you're missing out on a great opportunity to have someone who's going to come and volunteer for you and do what they can to help your organization fulfill its mission. So I think that's huge. I think it's huge to follow up with people and to make sure that you're getting what you want. And I will tell you, my son is in a youth group at our church, and they raise money every year for a mission trip. And these kids go and do a mission trip every year. And while they're on their mission trip, they send a letter signed by the kids and with a picture of the kids that one of the kids doing some work on the mission trip. And it is impactful because it does tell you where your money went. And these people aren't giving hundreds of thousands of dollars, but it is a nice little way to know that your money is being used in a way that you appreciate and that they're appreciating the fact that you've donated. So AJ, you've got another article for us?
I do. So this one comes from actually the Nonprofit Quarterly here. And the title of it is COVID-19 and Donor Advised Funds in 2020. What do the numbers tell us? So before we get started, I kind of like to let everybody know what a donor advised fund is, because these have been around for a while, but they really came into vogue, I guess, at the beginning of the Trump era because of the tax changes that were made to the Schedule A charitable donations. And these actually provide you a tax break. And essentially what you do is you invest your money, or you give your money to what's known as a donor advised fund. Then that donor advised fund makes donations through the fund itself to different charitable organizations, and you get a tax break on the money that you've put in for what's known as a DAF. So the article talks about kind of what's happened to these donor advised funds during the pandemic. And they know that the holdings are significant. According to the National Philanthropic Trust, at the end of 2019, there was about $142 billion deposited into DAFs, including $38 billion in new contributions in 2019 alone. So think of these as kind of like for lack of a better word, an endowment fund that they dole out kind of the earnings and some of the donations to charitable organizations. And they kind of act as a savings or checking account in that way. And so donors make irrevocable gifts to the DAFs and get a charitable tax reduction. And then donors can kind of recommend disbursements to specific donation or to specific kind of organizations. But on average, the DAFs, they donate to a large variety of them. 76% of the donations get dispersed to nonprofits within 5 years and 89% within 10 years, certainly faster than most foundation payout rates. So DAFs seem to use that. I guess the issue that they're coming up with is they would like to increase what they call the rainy day fund or emergency charitable stimulus based on doubling foundation minimum payouts from 5 to 10% and requiring 10% payouts from each individual DAF account for 3 years based on the pandemic needs of a lot of the nonprofits. So I'd kind of like to get the panel's experience maybe with DAFs, or if they had ever heard of them, or if this sounds like a good idea. I guess, this has steadily risen in kind of the charitable donations that are given to these donor advised funds. And also the amount that's being released has gone up significantly in these. So probably 31% increase over 2019 and 2020. Just in donations alone. But I'd like your guys' take on it, and maybe I'm missing something here, but this kind of sounds like the new donation route. And I know a lot of like the nonprofits I work with look at these as kind of the new membership donation, I guess, for lack of a better word.
I've actually not seen any of these with the not-for-profits that I've worked with. But I like the idea. I think it makes sense from a personal perspective, right? As a donor, it makes sense to be able to do that and put that money aside. I found it interesting that, when they were talking about donations by sector, how they've changed from January to June of 2020 versus January to June of 2019. And in the pandemic, how things have moved. The healthcare sector was up over 50%. Human services was up almost 80%. The arts were down 9% in their giving. So it's interesting, to see how things have shifted during the pandemic with the donor advised funds. I think that's probably indicative of giving in general. I don't think it's much different. I think that, I'm looking at it and I'm going, people are giving this money and it's sitting there and it's not going out for, 8-10 years. Why isn't that money going out any quicker? Is there a way to get that money out quicker, especially in times of need? And I don't know what the answer is, but I think that's something to think about. If you're doing this, if you're going to think about giving to a DAF or investing in a DAF, how quickly is your money going to go out? How long is it going to sit there and not do what you intended it to do? So, Tammy, you got any thoughts?
Yeah, mine were similar to yours, Lisa. That's where I struggle. I thought that how the donations by sector have changed a little bit made sense, especially because of COVID, but with the arts and stuff, which is interesting though, because they probably need the money the most, right? Because they aren't getting money because people can't go to the museums or go experience art. And so then I was like, well, if you have money that's sitting there, how frustrating it must be then to not be able to utilize it for this rainy day or pandemic or whatever may happen where the need is a lot stronger and that you need it. So I see where AJ is saying this is probably going to be the type of donation in the future, but it is kind of a difficult thing when you're experiencing a time where you have money and funds there and the need is there to use it. And it's like, can you expedite the disbursements, or is there a way to get those sooner? And I haven't seen DAFs in action on myself, so I'm not quite sure if there are ways to change the getting the money sooner. How about you, AJ?
Yeah, I think it's very much like an investment kind of banking. I don't want to call it a scheme, but it is very analogous to an investment. So, or like kind of locally, we have a endowment fund that everybody uses called OCF, or Oregon Foundation. And so they hold your money and then they distribute earnings. And essentially this is very similar to that. And so I guess from an investment standpoint, if they're holding onto the money, they're essentially banking on making more to distribute. So, I guess you can see it from that side, but I'm with both of you. I feel like the art should have got more money. That was really probably needed more than anything. I'm sure health and human services, and I know this from experience, got a lot of money thrown at them from all directions. And for those to be increased the most through the donor advised fund, of course, it's what in vogue during COVID, but I think, if people can find it in their hearts out there to help support the arts during this time, realistically, those are the ones that really need it. But what's our topic for discussion this week, Lisa?
So today we're going to talk about board composition, kind of high level, number of board members, kind of roles of board members. Should you have board committees? What should they be? So I'll start a little bit. When you think about a board, you want to have people on your board. You got it. Well, let's start with this. We're going to start. And so we're going to talk about officers. You got to have certain officers on your board. You got to have a president. You got to have a secretary. You got to have a treasurer, right? Your secretary records all your board minutes. Make sure that everything you're doing is in compliance with your bylaws, with state and local laws, whatever. Your president presides over all your meetings, makes sure things run smoothly, and is ultimately the one responsible for just about everything. Your treasurer is the one that's taking care of making sure that you're getting your financial information, making sure that it is appropriate, it is accurate. Your treasurer does not have to be an accountant. They just have to be the one that's working with the accountants to make sure that that your numbers are good, right? So why don't you give us a little bit on like what the roles of the board are?
So in terms of the general board members, so with the board members, they're really there to help steer the overall organization into their values and mission and what the organization is doing. So, to participate fully with the rest of the board as well, but in terms of how to help the organization grow and serve their mission and align with their values on that side. So I think that's what I would say in general, a pretty high level of how they support. But they, you do have the treasurer and you do have the president and the secretary, but the general board members are still reviewing that information as well. And, whether they may not be taking the minutes and doing those things, but they are reading them. They may not be working with the accountants on the financial statements, but they are reviewing the financials. So they have an understanding as to what the financial structure is for the organization, and doing that as well. So that's what I see on that side.
I think one of the things we touched on early and maybe kind of glossed over, but I'd like to dive into a little deeper, is the size of your board. So often I see this a lot with smaller nonprofits that have kind of just started, organizing a board, and they have the bare minimum. Usually their secretary like moonlights as the finance or as the treasurer. And then, there's constantly shifting roles and they have a problem bringing board members in. I would say as a rule of thumb, usually your board size should probably mirror the size of the organization. If you have a very small organization, you're probably going to have a very small board. And that's only because there's probably not as much in-depth board things to do in a smaller organization. If you have, for instance, the treasurer role in a very small, simple nonprofit is probably very simple as well. You're probably reviewing a very simple set of financial statements, whereas the larger the organization is and the more complex, the more people you need, on the finance committee, looking at those numbers and steering, understanding the direction that the organization is going in. And I would say the same for subcommittees or even like, supplementary roles on the board itself, planning committees and things like that. If you have a very small, simple organization, there's not much planning that goes around if you don't have anything going on besides one project or one mission. So I would say, of those five listed, you probably, the five main board members. Outside of that, you probably want to grow your board as much as the organization will lend itself to. Because I think the really sad thing to see is board members that are really engaged and wanting to do something, and there's nothing for them to do because the organization just doesn't lend itself to that, and they kind of feel stifled or that their time isn't being used correctly. So I think, unless somebody has a contrarian view to that, I that's just how I feel though about board size.
The only thing I would add to that is that there is probably a sweet spot though too, because sometimes you have too many people, and then it's going to be hard to have a discussion or to really get a lot of participation in a way that everyone's being heard. So if you have, I don't know what the number may be in terms of what the sweet spot would be, but if you have, 40 people on a board, then you're going to have a lot, hard time giving enough time for those to speak and share their opinions. But at the same time, if you have them too small, then like you have all these subcommittees that you may want to participate in, but if you only have a small, like 10 people, you might have multiple people serving on the subcommittees. And then, they may feel a little bit overwhelmed by the amount of time that they have to spend on the various aspects of the board. So there's, I don't know if Lisa, if you have like a recommendation as to what the size may be, but it does seem like there's too small and then there's too big. So like what's in the middle?
Yeah, that's a tough one to really answer. I mean, I guess I go back to AJ on his point where, he's talking about the fact that you want to kind of make it match the size of your organization, right? You don't want to have an organization of 20 people and have a board of 40 people because that doesn't make any sense. You got to kind of work with what you got. Although, when you're first starting out in your with a not-for-profit. So I'm going to like just switch it up a bit and talk about like what the board is supposed to do, right? The board is not management. The board is supposed to provide strategy, oversight, and accountability. Those are the three things that the board should really do. The board should not be managing the day-to-day of the operation or the organization. The only caveat to that is if you're a brand new foundation or organization, not-for-profit organization, sometimes the board has to jump in and help manage some of those day-to-day things. But once it's up and running, honestly, the board should not be involved in the day-to-day. I know of an organization where that is not the case, and the board is just so involved in the organization that they cannot keep an executive director because the executive director wants to come in and do their job, but at that level, you also don't want to be told how to do your job and what you're supposed to do and have to go to the board to get a $50 expense approved. It becomes a hindrance. So we don't want to see that either. We want the board to really be more of an oversight organization. You don't want people on your board that are just going to try to go in and manage the organization. Hire them as your manager, as your executive director. It's kind of my opinion. Anyone else got any other thoughts?
I think one thing you missed in the list of duties of board members is they are fundraisers. Your board is your best advocate, and they're also probably your best fundraising outlet as well. Like most 99.9% of the boards that I've been on, they're called you're a board member and you're a giving board member, which means you either bring in donations or you're donating money yourself to help fund the organization. And it's a requirement of serving on the board is to give some portion of money or bringing in some portion of money to support that organization. And I guess, that goes back, I guess, maybe and kind of flubs my first thing is, the more board members you have, the more money you should be bringing in. So maybe a lot of these smaller organizations are, if they're fiscally smart about it or savvy about it, they're wanting lots of people on the board to be able to donate. But just like Tammy said, when you have that many people on the board, it can be you can dilute the conversation around things. And I think, people may feel unheard and may feel unsatisfied in trying to help the organization. And so I think, from a fundraising standpoint, it may be nice to have more board members, but you really want somebody that's dedicated and involved in the mission of what's going on. But then, and all these are really fine lines to strike here because you don't want them then micromanaging the operations of the organization. They're really there as an executive director oversight and then an oversight of what's going on in a very broad stroke and not necessarily on a employee by employee basis or a program by program basis. You should have a good knowledge of what's going on in the organization, where they're headed and how they're getting there. And you should have a broad sense of the financial stability of the organization. But to Lisa's point, if you're really digging in and doing day-to-day operational things, there's a disconnect there. Either the organization isn't functioning correctly or the board isn't functioning correctly where they feel that they need to be involved in those sorts of things.
I liked what you said there too, because I was going to add, I think one thing that I'd like to add is that when you're building a board or you're kind of thinking about who to be on a board, think about kind of what their skill sets are. So even though, your treasurer doesn't have to be a financial, accountant type of person, if you feel like that's a need that your board has, then try to get a CPA or get someone who's an accountant who also is aligned with the mission and the values that could be on your board. If for legal advice or, legal kind of viewpoint, get a lawyer, or, try to see if you can get a lawyer who, again, aligns with the mission and the values of the organization, but see if they can be on the board. Because I do think with fundraising, there's some people who love to fundraise and love to use their networks and fundraise. And there's some people who they do not. They want to participate in the organization, but the idea of fundraising is, may keep them from being a part of the organization. So it's good to say, hey, you may not have to be a fundraiser. You may want to donate on your own accord, but let's get someone who's really great at fundraising too, so they can give that lens. Again, not running the day-to-day business, because I would hope that, the board doesn't want to do that. And the organization definitely doesn't want that to happen either, but that you have some skill sets that can help with those conversations when you're steering the organization going forward.
And I have seen boards, like, since we're accountants and we're talking about accountants in the treasury role, and how it's not necessarily a requirement. And I would say, I've seen some really savvy boards for treasurers go after people in the banking sphere that can be really helpful. And, I don't know how many board meetings you guys have been in, but financing always comes up at some point in a not-for-profits organizational, trajectory, whether it is a line of credit to stay, as a bridge loan, whether it's credit cards to be able to flex spend during a month, or it's changing banks because, the bank that they're working with, they don't like, or they're not offering them the services that they want. Mm-hmm. And having somebody in that banking realm can really help. Because it is something outside of the accounting profession. We may deal with banks and know who's nice to deal with, or who has nonprofits in their portfolio or in their sector of banking. But a banker knows much more the ins and outs of what it takes to, have a healthy enough organization to be able to be afforded a line of credit, or, what the requirements are if a nonprofit wants to take out a loan to buy a building, or, for instance, or if you're especially if you're in the low profit or the housing market and you're in low income housing, having a banker on your board that has connections with, being able to do bridge loans and funding for that kind of stuff is invaluable. And of course, Tammy mentioned lawyers. At some point in just like any business, I think, but at some point in a nonprofit's life, they're going to have a legal situation that they're going to need counsel from. And just having somebody on the board that is a lawyer in the community, that's your best reference for something that comes up. So I think, like Tammy said, there's some people that really like fundraising, but I think there's also other niches in the nonprofit sphere that you can kind of go out and find professions that help. If you are a low income housing, it wouldn't hurt to have some construction, professionals on the board. It's endless here. If you're in the mental health space, clinicians, like people that are on the ground, on the ground floor of knowing who needs help, what, grants and programs are available to you. So I think, I guess molding your board around your mission and your needs kind of is probably the best rule of thumb. All right. Thanks for watching another episode of Profitless on Purpose, the nonprofit focused accounting podcast. Make sure you add us on Twitter at ProfitlessPod, and we'll be posting some statements of thought there if you're interested. And make sure you hit the like and subscribe button, ring the notification bell, tell your friends all about us. I'm sure they'd love a listen. And make sure you give us 5 stars on your favorite podcasting application where you found us. So until next week, for all of us, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.